All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. And when I said conversation, that really is what I'm hoping this is going to be. That, this isn't something where I'm going to do a large presentation for you or anything like that. I sincerely hope that we can speak together, we can think together about the concept of identity and culture and why it matters so much. So my name is Chenthu Jayachandiran. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and his. I also respond to they. And I serve as the director of the Cultural Center and Spiritual Life at the University of Denver. And first and foremost, I want to um, acknowledge that, we in the Denver area um, are kind of inhabiting lands that were originally that of the Arapaho and Cheyenne nations. Um, and, we, part of the gold rush is something that displaced those communities. And certainly we now have a responsibility to take care of this land in their stead. And part of the conversation about culture and identity is understanding, where we are originally from, understanding um, what histories and legacies inform our individual experiences. Um, and also being curious about the histories and legacies of the people that we interact with, so that we, um, you know, so that we are taking care of them as they take care of us. And this conversation, I think, is especially important in the current geopolitical climate that we find ourselves in. Um, Conversations about race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, immigrant status, ability, are all in the forefront of our national discourse right now. And I wanted to take some time uh, to have this conversation with you, um, because we can't escape it. It is inevitable that this conversation is going to enter the sphere of your students, of your family, of your network, and we want to be able to have these conversations in meaningful ways. So um, so that's the main kind of impetus for wanting to do this work. Now, I am by training a critical cultural scholar, and by identity, I am an immigrant refugee. And the and so I have a profound appreciation for this idea of citizenship, this idea of Americanness, and I have a profound appreciation for belonging, because that is what I left my home country uh, and came here seeking to find. So I think it's that is what kind of drew me into this work, and I've been doing this work in one way or the other for the last 20 years. Um, so I want to at least start us off with um, some agreement on what it is that we are facing. Now, the University of Denver is a predominantly white institution. What I mean by that is that our minoritized communities are treasured, but they are few and far in between. Right, our institutions, our hallways, our classrooms are going to be predominantly white, predominantly um, heteronormative, predominantly able-bodied people. Um, and what that means is that there is a disproportionate burden on those minoritized communities to then educate the larger populations um, about identity and culture. Um, and oftentimes that labor is free labor, right? Because the people who are doing that work, primarily students, don't get compensated for that. They don't um, they don't get paid for it. And part of what I want us to think about is how do we correct that imbalance? How do we make it so that all of us are taking on that responsibility to learn about culture, to be curious about identity, and then use that information and knowledge to be better citizens. And by citizens, I don't mean the legal term citizens, but better custodians of the people that we interact with, right? A second kind of starting point that I want us to acknowledge is that, minoritized communities experience all kinds of microaggressions and harm as they move through a predominantly white majoritarian kinds of institution. Um, Now, I could tell you plenty of stories of my own experiences of moving through predominantly white institutions as a person of color. If I were to shave my beard and shave off my hair, most people mistake me for black. And with it comes a lot of experiences that you can um, that I think is probably quite close to your imagination. You can probably imagine what it's like to go through life as a person of color, as someone who is black. So that's the second thing. If you are a person of color, if you are LGBTQ plus, person with a disability, a person who learns differently with some kind of neurodiversity, they experience harm as they go through life. The third thing I want to start off with is, and this isn't necessarily a fact, but this is a an assumption and a grace that I want to at least own, and that is that uh, people, individuals, are generally good, kind people. They want to do right. They want to do right by themselves. They want to do right by others. So, but somewhere in between, because those numbers 2 and 3 don't always sit well together, right? If minoritized communities experience harm, but people are also fundamentally good and trying to do right. Well, if 3 is true, then why is 2 happening, right? And that's a reasonable question. So I think one of the things that I want to distinguish is between um, intent and impact, right? Well-intended actions can still have harmful impacts. And that, I think, is often what we see play out. So then the question is, if we want to create these kind of communities where everybody can grow and thrive, what do we need to do to make sure that our impact isn't harmful? And that's the kinds of conversation that I want us to engage in. And I want you to also acknowledge, given the geopolitical landscape that we have, if a student were to go through their 4 or 5 years at DU and they don't have a conversation about race or ethnicity or marginalization, then something is wrong with the way we're doing education, right? Because um, these conversations need to happen. And the Cultural Center and my staff are certainly going to um, push that agenda. We have partners in academe who are also doing that kind of work. And we certainly want to engage our students. It's not necessarily about indoctrinating them into a certain way of thinking, but we absolutely want them to think critically about the information they consume and the world that they move around in. That is the bigger agenda. And part of wanting to have this conversation with parents is to invite you to be to partner in this. We want you to have those conversations with them when they come home, when you talk to them on the phone, when you talk to them over Zoom, whether you're, you know, family, friends, loved ones. Um, we want you to engage them in those conversations as well. Um, so, so that's what this conversation is about. And I certainly want this to be a conversation. So let me stop with my remarks at that point, and invite a conversation, whether it's question, answers. If there are comments, feel free to put it in the chat. If there are questions, feel free to use the Q&A box, or if you raise your hands, my colleague Sharon will open your mic up so that you can speak your own mind, right? So yeah, so let me invite people to join in.
We do have one question right now, Chenthu.
Yeah, let's do it.
My son is admittedly a little sheltered. We are from a small town. Will there be opportunities for him to learn about different types of people? I worry he might say the wrong thing and alienate himself.
Thank you. Thank you very much for asking that. Let me tell you this. I am a 20-year veteran of this kind of work, and I still worry I might say the wrong thing and alienate someone, right? And the thing is, it's not necessarily about saying the wrong thing. It's about what you do when someone points it out to you, right? There is this fantastic scholar by the name of Mia McKenzie who talks about making mistakes in being allies or doing the work of allyship. And she says, there's nothing wrong with mistakes as long as you never make the same mistake twice, right? The first mistake is absolutely okay. The idea is that you learn from it and you try not to repeat it. In terms of opportunities for your son to engage with people from different cultures and identities, there are going to be plenty. And I think the fact that you're already thinking about that gives me incredible hope. And I hope you'll have that conversation with your son and encourage him to go out to events that are put on by the various student organizations, by the affinity groups, and be a bit courageous to make some mistakes, right? What you don't want is the fear of making mistakes to push you into silence. Because then what happens is then you go through the next 3 years without taking full advantage of those learning opportunities. So I absolutely think there will be opportunities. I would encourage you to have a conversation with him and push him to take some chances, go to some of these events. And I also think, there are simple things that he can do. When he's in class, try not to look for comfort of familiarity, but instead be courageous enough to engage with the unfamiliar. Curiosity is this beautiful tool. It really is the foundation of our learning, and done right, curiosity will open all kinds of doors for learning. So thank you very much for asking that question. I sincerely hope you have that conversation with your son. Yeah. What else?
Thank you for that. I have another question that's in.
Yeah.
It says, I'm interested in hearing discussion about what are the most helpful, productive ways that students can participate in or contribute to the efforts towards correcting racial injustice. As a parent, I want to support my daughter, but also worry about potentially dangerous, because of COVID risk or escalating tensions, dangerous activities.
Yeah, I think, Rebecca, thank you very much for that question. And, I think it's important to understand, because racial injustice is so multifaceted, contesting racial injustice also has to be multifaceted. So what I mean by that is, protesting, going out and marching aren't the only ways to do it, because racial injustice is everywhere, right? So for instance, if your daughter were to witness racial injustice happening, sometimes just being a witness is in itself powerful. Sometimes just saying, what is being perpetrated here is an injustice. Just speaking that truth, making it explicit, that is a form of contesting racial injustice. Voting is a form of contesting racial injustice. When immediately after George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, and I use that term intentionally. I do think it is murder. Certainly, the legal system will run its course. But right after that, I didn't necessarily go out and participate in a whole bunch of marches. But what I did, because I went to school at the University of Wisconsin, because I had a lot of friends at the University of Minnesota Law School, what I did was I just started calling all of my lawyer friends in Minnesota. And I asked them if they would be willing to go to the precincts and represent people who, protesters who were arrested, and do it pro bono, right? That's a form of contesting racial injustice. Blogging is a form of contesting racial injustice. Donating to worthy causes is a form of contesting racial injustice. So I think that there are so many different ways to do this work. Presence is certainly one of them. Marching is certainly one of them. It's powerful. It has symbolic value. But that's not the only game in town. There are lots of different ways to do this. And I think, one of the things that I found is students are very creative. They will come up with ways to have their say, to leave their mark. Even if you're sitting in a classroom and you see a professor saying something that exposes a blind spot, that leaves out a community, speaking up and saying, hey, what you said forgets people of color. That's a form of contesting racial injustice. So Rebecca, I think there are lots of different ways to do it, and all of them matter. All of them need to happen because injustice is so pervasive. So thank you.
We have another question. How does DU address anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim issues on campus?
Yeah, I think there are a few different ways to do this. I think, you know, anti-Semitism and anti-Islamism um, are increasingly becoming a problem. And I think part of what we have to do is contesting these kinds of phobias have to be visible, right? You can't do that in a back room. You can't just pull together uh, our Jewish community and say, and check in and say, how are you doing, and support them. There has to be a visible kind of contestation and condemning of these things. Um, and those are things I think, you know, with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion now in place as this kind of central office, we have the infrastructure in place to start making those kinds of more public engagements on those things. Certainly, you know, as the director for spiritual life, I will do the one-on-one reach outs, the community support to make sure that those who are harmed are taken care of. We will partner with community organizations, bring in faith leaders from the community to do that kind of work. One of the things that we are doing is we have an interfaith council that pulls together faculty from the various faith studies, and we are going to create a more robust interfaith dialogue on justice, so that we're not waiting for an anti-Semitic or an anti-Islam event to happen before responding. Yeah, thank you for that question. But I think, being more transparent with when they happen, being transparent about the harm they do, is the way to do it. Like this fight needs to happen in the sunlight. It can't happen in the dark. And I think we now have the ODEI office, which is positioned to do that kind of work.
Okay, the next question. All right. Under different circumstances, I would expect that a college campus would be a hotbed of activity during a presidential election. It was for me back in 1984. What might our students expect for on-campus activities where these sorts of topics would be discussed in an open public forum? I'm afraid that there will be few opportunities to hear on-campus speakers this year.
Yeah, you're right. There used to be a time when campuses really were the place for civic discourse on the most important issues of our time. I miss that too. I'm not entirely sure what it is about this generation of students that they are a little bit reticent. I think part of it is just a disillusionment with the political process. I think there is a problem in the way we have done politics in this country for a while. That we have blurred the lines between governance and politics. And part of the problem is when politics is what is the centering force, you know, then we forget that the political decisions have impact on governance and policy. And I think that there is a shift in the way we cover governance in the media. I think a lot of the media organizations are much more interested in the politics of power and the drama of it, and less so about governance. I will own my stripes. In my home country, I used to be a political analyst for a member of parliament and a speechwriter, and I loved government. I hated politics, but I loved government. And to me, you know, reading policy documents, reading legislation to see, you know, this is the impact, these are the dollar amounts, this is what it's going to do for the next 2 generations if we commit to a particular policy initiative, that mattered. And that's what drove me to be active in voting. And I think we've missed that. Something about our discourse has changed where we focus so much more on politics and not at all on governance. So I think in terms of what we can do, this is going to sound terrible, but sometimes just watching C-SPAN might do the trick, because that is much more about governance. But how are you going to get this generation to watch C-SPAN, right? But I think reading ballot measures, talking to your students at home about ballot measures, those are ways to get them reinvigorated. And I think some of that is happening more now, with more and more of our students participating in the marches and the protests, and the fundraising and all that. I think something is happening. There's a little bit of a sea change, and I'm hoping it pushes us through. I know within the Cultural Center, one of the things that we are planning is to have a series of 5 you know, dialogues or workshops, you know, one on foreign policy, one on the economy, one on the environment, one on identity, and the last one on government and democracy. Now, because it's through the Cultural Center, we are going to approach it through the lens of identity and culture, all 5 of the sessions. And we are going to invite, you know, subject matter experts to come and participate in these dialogues, in these panels. So please encourage your student to watch out for that and join us. There is a working committee at the University of Denver that is planning an entire series of events around the November elections. Everything from preparing students with you know, workshops on how to talk about issues, then to kind of the content and the subject matter on what they should be looking out for, and then to work through the aftermath of the elections, no matter how they turn out, right? No matter how they turn out, somebody's going to be angry, somebody's going to be hurt, and that means we have to prepare for that. So there is a working group who are thinking and talking about how we want to approach that. Certainly the Cultural Center's efforts are part of that larger project. I know my colleague Beth is also on the line. As we were putting together Crimson Connect, which is the place that's going to aggregate all of our student programming, I had asked if we could have a what are those called? Is it a hashtag? Is it a tag? Right? That's the term, right? A tag.
Yeah.
If one of the tags could be government or politics, so that if a student were to go into Crimson Connect and search by that tag, they will see a whole bunch of events that deal with precisely this kind of content. So yeah, Jeff, please encourage your student to go, get on Crimson Connect, look for that tag, and hopefully that will re-engage them.
All right, the next question is somewhat related. Thank you, and to build on your comments, what can we do to get this generation to vote in November and every November? My husband and I have been leading by example, and both of our kids have voted in every primary and every election. I wonder what we can do to get more parents to help make sure that their kids know the importance of voting.
Yeah, and this is why I wanted to have this conversation with you all, right? Like, parents are crucial partners in this work. And thank you so much for, being that kind of example and getting your kids out to vote. When I was at Iowa, I used to teach intercultural communication. And one of the, there was this one class I remember where our students were talking about how voting didn't matter, and how no matter what happens, their vote doesn't count because, I was at the University of Iowa, which is in Johnson County, a very kind of democratic county. And they were like, oh, the counties are drawn in such a way that my vote doesn't count. And I said, well, you can't just show up every 4 years for the presidential election and then expect your votes to count, because here's the thing. How the districts are drawn aren't decided at the presidential elections. Those are decided in the local elections. So if you don't show up at the local elections, yeah, you are going to be disenfranchised. There are powerful forces at play that would really like your vote not to count or not to matter. Sometimes it's just having an honest conversation with the students. There is this one student who was in that class. Now, every year on November election day, she will text me and says, since that class, I've always voted in the midterm elections. And she'll write to me every November and say, hey, just letting you know, I voted this November. Right? So I think it goes back to that thing, right? The difference between politics and governance. Politics is about figuring out how to win. Governance is about how to make people's lives better. And I think the sad truth is we've forgotten to talk about governance in productive ways. So in terms of how to get more parents to have this conversation, my understanding is that you all have a parents' council. Is that right, Beth? Can you correct me? I'm brand new at DU, by the way. I've been on the job for less than a month. So, Beth, there's a parents' council of sorts, right? Or a Facebook group or something like that?
Sharon, you're better to chime in on this.
Yeah.
Okay. I was going to jump, but then he was addressing you. So
my apologies, please.
No, that's okay. There is a parents Facebook group and very lively conversation in there. There's a lot of idea sharing and resource sharing between parents on there, which is really great. We don't have a general parent council at the university. We used to have a parents council that gathered together, but it was so few in number, and there was, some conversation about the travel that took place. Now we have a different type of opportunity, given that we have this virtual environment. So we can engage people in different ways, but a lot of families are engaging on Facebook, so they're able to share instantly and, like I said, gain some resources and have conversations about these very things. But we also all know that the social media environment is anonymous in some ways, in a lot of ways, and it's not the best platform to have honest, engaging dialogue in the way that is productive. I like this. I think that this is one of the best ways to engage folks. I think this is a very good way to start these conversations, and maybe this is what we'll continue with in the future.
Yeah. And, you know, I think there's an opportunity there where you could, you know, potentially start on Facebook and collect a set of emails or collect a set of names who might be interested in having a conversation, you know, parent to parent. How do I get my student more engaged in citizenship? And, you know, y'all can think together. If you put something like that together and say, hey, Chenthu, would you mind coming in and facilitating that dialogue? I'd be there, you know, in the shake of a goat's tail, right? Like I would love um, to facilitate that kind of conversation. And I think, you know, it's um, having those conversations at the Thanksgiving table, at dinner, right? Like too often, you know, these conversations are seen as difficult, and then you know, you could take the easy way out and say, right. I've been at several Thanksgiving tables of friends where they say religion and politics are off limits. I'm like, why? How about religion and governance? Can we do that? Right. So I think, you know, if y'all can use some of the existing social media channels to collect parents who want to have this conversation. Certainly DU has, you know, within the faculty and staff, we have the necessary talent and thought leaders who could come and participate and contribute to that conversation. So yeah, so if somebody who's on this call wants to organize that, yeah, we're game. We'll come to play.
Absolutely. I think that would be a very good way to do that, because as I just saw in the Q&A here, there's a question about whether it's possible to see what's on the Facebook page, because this person is not on Facebook. So unfortunately, unless you are on Facebook, you don't see that activity going on. You know, in a lot of ways, that's, you know, probably saving you some mental energy for sure. But,
Yeah.
you know, sometimes that engagement is very good. And we share the resources from DU on the Facebook group, but we also email the same resources to everyone. So you're not missing anything that's part of DU's conversation with parents, if that makes sense. You know, what you would miss is the conversation between parents on Facebook. And yeah, unless you're part of that platform, you do miss that piece of it, unfortunately. And yeah, there isn't a copy of that going on anywhere. You know, but as Chenthu was saying, we have some opportunity here given this environment, and that not everyone, a lot of people are starting to get very used to Zoom calls.
Yeah.
Starting to get used to engaging in the online environment in a very different way than they have ever before. Access is becoming much more of a conversation also, because it's not necessarily you know, something that's reserved for sometimes. There are a lot of schools that now rely on this type of engagement. So those conversations are being brought up to the surface, and a lot of people are you know, making sure that they do have access now, and you know, prompting school districts also to come up with solutions for them when they hadn't done that before.
Yeah. And, you know, as parents, I would encourage you all to organize and have a parents' council. There is value in that. That's not just kind of creating spaces where these kinds of conversations can happen. Talking about best practices on how to support a college-age child as they navigate this incredibly tenuous world that we live in right now. But it's also a way for parents to advocate on behalf of their students to the university. Um, and this is the organizer in me coming out, right? But I think there's value in creating a parents' council, coming up with your own constitution, maybe register as a nonprofit so that you can do some serious advocacy work. But hey, that's me. Look at me. I'm 1 month old at DU and I'm already creating waves. But worth looking into.
Shall we move to another question?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, this one is, are there voter registration drives on campus and people present to explain to students if they are eligible to vote in Colorado or should vote in their home state?
Ooh, that's an excellent question. And Sharon, you might have to help me out with this because of the kind of social distancing protocols that we have. The traditional voter registration drives, I doubt are going to happen because there's just too much risk involved with having those. My guess is that there will probably be a substantial kind of voter education drive that happens that talks about how you register, how do you request your absentee ballot, whether you should vote in Colorado or your home state. My guess is that is much more likely. Voter registration drives in their traditional form, I doubt will happen. Sharon, can you give us any more clarity on that? Because I think you're more familiar with the programming protocols.
Yeah, sure. 4 years ago, there were campaigns like that going on the campus. We had the voter registration drive going on. Student government was very visible. We had tabling going on the campus as well. Getting the word out, this is how you figure out if you're registered to vote. This is what you do if you are voting in your home state, or if you have Colorado residency, this is how you vote. All of these different things were going on. And it's true, yes, that this will be very different given the pandemic. So I know that student government is already planning to be very active with this campaigning going on. To make sure that students are getting registered to vote and also giving that voter education about how to vote in your home state, or if you are eligible to vote in Colorado or your home state, how to figure all of that out and make it easy for students to continue with their engagement in the voter process. So they're developing that right now. There are some conversations going on already. And even though we won't have the paper out on tables and have that being done, we have different ways of accomplishing that now, of course, right? So we have, online platforms where you can check to see if you're registered to vote. And I think the campaigning is just going to be done in a different way, virtually if necessary, or also, through other campaigns and signage posted on campus. I'm sure that's going to get very active right away as soon as the students are back on campus.
Oh, and Rebecca, I think, has a comment for the parent who asked about being afraid to make mistakes. Rebecca says, for the parent who wants to help her son not say the wrong thing. I also grew up in a very small town, and I found that if you are truly coming from a place of curiosity and wanting to learn, people will show you some grace, even if you get the words wrong. Encourage your son to ask the questions while coming from the right place, and others will be accepting of that and happy to help him learn. And Rebecca also put in on LGBTQ plus questions. Here's a resource that has helped me. Maybe we can move that into the chat. And certainly asking questions is fantastic. Um, but people aren't the only place where you can learn from, right? You could also learn by reading books and blogs. If you by following various activists who are doing this work on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. I always get it wrong and I say TikTok and everybody laughs, but it's TikTok, right? There are so many different ways to learn. And that's one of the reasons why I started off with talking about this imbalance in responsibility for learning about these issues, right? Certainly, talking to a black or a queer person is a fantastic way to learn about blackness or queerness, but that's not the only way to learn. You could go and buy a book. You could read a blog. You could follow someone on Instagram or Twitter. There are all these different ways that you can learn. One of the things that when I was teaching intercultural communication, I asked all of my students to do was to look at their Facebook friends list, or look at their LinkedIn network list. And I asked them to see how many people of color, how many LGBTQ people are on their networks, right? And if they find that most of the people they have are white or heteronormative, I tell them, you need to do some extra work to make sure your network is more diverse. Because what happens when your network is diverse is that you start to hear and see the stories that those community members want to share on your feed. And those can be powerful places of learning, right? Because those are voluntary stories that they have put out into the social sphere. And that's a place for you to learn, because those kinds of stories, those people, the black and the queer people, they put those stories out because those stories might be cathartic for them to speak out, or because that's voluntary labor they're willing to do, right? The other thing is, when your network is different, the kinds of stories that show up on your feed are also different. Why? Because that's the way algorithms work, right? So just diversifying your network makes a difference. And there's some interesting research that's coming out from the University of Pennsylvania that suggests that the diversity and the density of your networks are predictive of your time to first employment after graduation, your first time salary, and tenure earnings, right? So the more dense and more diverse your network is, the better off you're going to be. So if you are ever looking for a reason to be more mindful of being an inclusive kind of citizen, there you go, right? There are practical benefits to being someone who has a good relationship with some of these minoritized communities, because too often we depend on the moral argument to advance the inclusion agenda, right? We have to be inclusive because it's the right thing to do. That's the moral argument. And certainly it is the right thing to do. I'm not saying it isn't, but there is also an economic and pragmatic argument, right? By 2040, majority of the states are going to be majority minority, right? That means, when your students enter the workforce, when they are in their prime, the communities that they're going to invent for, distribute for, sell for, design for, isn't going to be all white, isn't going to be all straight. And if your student still wants to be a relevant scientist, thinker, designer, artist, they need to be able to, build meaningful relationships with people who don't look like them, sound like them, think like them, eat like them. So that's the pragmatic argument. So there's a moral argument, there's an economic argument, and there's a pragmatic one. And so if you're looking for reasons, there we go. No more questions? What else? What else are people thinking? They don't have to be questions. They can be comments, critiques. Ooh, I think my wife is in a conflict with our apartment manager. Can you all hear that? Oh, okay, good. Yeah, Rebecca. Oh gosh, what's the name of that scholar? He's at the University of Pennsylvania, and he is a communications networks scholar. I bet if you looked him up, you'll find him pretty easily. Oh gosh, why is that name not popping up? Feel free to email me later on. I'm going to put my email in chat, and I will find a way to, I will find the name of that scholar and pass it on. You are right, Jeff. There are no easy answers. And all the more reason why we should think about it and talk about it, right? We can learn from each other. We can think together and come up with some of these, come up with more nuanced ways of talking about this. So yeah, well, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciated the chance to speak with you about this. And if you all do organize and put together that parent council, and you want to talk some more about how to talk through these things, let us know. We'll be happy to help. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of the evening. And thank you, Sharon and Beth, for putting this together. I really appreciate your work.
Thank you, Chenthu. Really appreciate it. This has been a really great conversation.
Indeed, indeed. Have a good night, everybody.